6:59. Okay, 1 minute. What?
They weren't siblings.
Yeah, they are.
Oh, oh.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Ray, Black. Walker's first.
Do you race?
He had two new additions to his family.
Lead article.
Well, you can't, it's just, we're just so.
We're just silly. I mean, that's great. I'm missing my little first RJ.
Oh, you have a person.
Yeah.
Probably the damage is done.
Yeah.
He's just the silliest thing.
But they're very entertaining.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the immortal words of Walter Winchell, good evening, Mr. and Mrs. North and South America, and all the ships at sea. Welcome to the February 2022 meeting of the Tallahassee Historical Society. Folks who are with us in person and folks who are with us by Zoom. We are coming to you tonight from conference room B, I think, of the Leon County Public Library, downtown Tallahassee. I'm Bob Holliday, president of the Historical Society, and this is stop number 5 or 6 on the Great Tallahassee Historical Society Roadshow. We decided to 5 or 4. We decided to take our show on the road this year, and next month we will be at Trinity United Methodist Church. Folks to be interested. We are so glad that you are with us. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Katherine Mooney from the FSU History Department. I've known Katherine for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years now, and I do have an apology to make to her and to you all. I will say these immortal words: Amherst and Yale, not Harvard. All of this time, I thought she attended Harvard because that's who published her book. I am right about that. I am right about that, but she went to Amherst and Yale, and she was very indignant when I tried to pass her off on Harvard. But anyway, I've known Katherine. I've been wanting to have Katherine speak to us for some time. She is she's native in New Orleans. She's an LSU fan. Is that correct? That kind of, sort of. Oh, no, very much so. They've got a new coach over there. And she also knows everything there is to know about horse racing. And this is a pretty interesting talk. I think you guys will like this tonight. This has to do with many things: African American history, agency, and identity, and also horse racing. So I'm going to shut up, which I know you all will like, and turn the floor over to Katherine.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I see at least 2 former students in the crowd, so I'm thrilled by that. And does anybody else? Yeah.
You know, none of us had masks on, and we could hear you a whole lot better if you took your mask off.
Trust me, I'm very good at projecting through this thing. I do undergraduates all day, every day. Now, let's start with this picture. It is the summer of 1890, and this is a pine thicket someplace on the New Jersey coast near Park Racetrack. We're not 100% sure who all these people are, but we know from the newspapers that many of them were biggest judges, legislators, and city officials in New York, Brooklyn, and surrounding So when you look at this picture, if you're like me, the first thing you think is, why on earth did all these guys in wool suits take trains from New York to eat at white tablecloth tables in the middle of a field? Well, the answer is they were all obsessed with one particular racehorse. This is the Salvatore Club, and they are fans of the great racehorse Salvatore. He had blazed through the summer of 1890. They'd all won money on him, and so they were there, to celebrate first of all this horse, right? So I think that tells us something that we need to sort of recognize as a premise here about the importance of horse racing in 19th century America. So for those of you keeping track, right, college football exists. It's beginning to be a very big deal, but it's still very much an Ivy League sport. Baseball exists. It's not as big a deal as it will be. Professional football is a while in the future. Basketball is still being played at the YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts. Horse racing is, in terms of an established sport, taking up all that energy that we associate with all of those other sports, right? So it is the kind of thing that makes people do crazy stuff. Now, the other thing that this picture, I think, tells us about racing is that it was, of all the sports then, boxing is certainly a recognized sport at this point, but it's the one that has the piece of modern day sports, which is the association with celebrity and glamour, and wealthy people from other walks of life get obsessed with it. And so this guy with beard here is actually J.B. Hagen, and J.B. Hagen was the money man behind Anaconda Copper. And Anaconda Copper was in the process of becoming one of the biggest conglomerates in American history. J.B. Hagen would soon be one of the richest men in the world. When they sold Anaconda Copper for what would now be $12 billion, he took all of his money to South America and basically ran a large part of Argentina for a while just for fun. So, you're dealing with this sort of pull that comes from that. But there's another reason these guys are just all sitting here doing this. And that reason, to some degree, is this one man here on the right, smiling, sort of. That's Isaac Murphy. And if you zoom back out, you'll see he is basically the only black man in the picture. And he is sitting at the little individual head table, right? He's sitting with not just guests, but with the most important guests. He's a jockey. And I tell people when I talk about him, you may never have heard of him, but everyone you've heard of in 19th century America, they do. And I'm actually in the process of writing a book about him because I think he does two things really well that I want to sort of focus on today. And one is that because he was born in slavery in a small town in the South, he actually shows us, because there's so much information about him because he is this famous athlete, he shows us through his life, the life of his family, the life of his friends, the work that regular people in the small town South did after the Civil War, after the Constitution had been changed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were in the Constitution, to actually make those things have meaning in ordinary people's lives. To go out and say, okay, it says on paper, I'm free and equal, but what does that actually mean? The other thing he does, because of what happens in the course of his career, is that I think he allows us to think seriously about the relationship Black superstar athletes in this country have always had to the ideas we have about the place of Black people in general in this country, because he certainly is tied up in those ideas. So if we start with his birth, he was born in slavery. He was born in January of 1861. His mother was the enslaved property of a farmer in Clark County, Kentucky. She was a teenager when he was born. Her name was America Murphy. And she had married in 1859 an enslaved man named Jerry Burns. And in 1864, after a long back and forth, that if you take my Civil War class, you would learn about whether Black men from states that had not seceded could be enlisted in the Union Army without the permission of their legal owners. Jerry Burns enlisted in the Union Army. That was the summer of '64. By the fall of '64, he had died of disease in pain, which of course, if you know anything about Civil War casualties, the vast majority of people who die in the war are dying of things that are very not glamorous, right? They die of digestive ailments like he did. They die of accidents, and he's one of those. So at that point, his son was 3 years old. Now, people spend a lot of time obsessing about Jerry Burns, the people who are interested in Massey Murphy, and I think it's because they're fascinated by this father, right? The father who risked his life to fight for freedom, and how dramatic it is that he had this amazing son. But in fact, if you think about the parent who was left with him, his mother, I think, has more than maybe anybody else to do with the person he became. We don't know when she decided to move from Clark County into Lexington, which was the local big town. But we do know that women like her were in danger precisely because her husband was in the army, and that local white people tended to try to attack the wives of men who were serving. So she may have gone for safety. She may have gone because she still had family in Lexington. But by the end of the war, she's established herself in Lexington. She's taking in laundry to make money. She had an established business. And she had presented herself to pension authorities as the widow of a soldier, the mother of his child. And she secured Jerry Burns' pension. And with the pension money and the laundry money, she started a bank account with the Freedmen's Bank, which was a federal institution that was designed to help former slaves collect capital, right, and keep it safe. And then with that money, she actually bought a small house, and she lived there with her son and her younger sister and her younger brother. So if you think about that family, his mother, to me, his father may be about the Civil War, but his mother is a woman of Reconstruction. His mother is a woman who, about 5 minutes after the government had decided they had to treat her as a human being, said, all right, I'm going to take you at your word, and I'm going to make you live up to it. So she is using all of these new processes and all of these new understandings of her as a citizen to make a secure place for her family and a future for her. And she does that very successfully. And it's even more striking to know that she did that when you understand that in central Kentucky, there was endemic violence against former slaves. And in fact, in 1866, a convention of her neighbors actually petitioned Congress to do something about the violence in central Kentucky because the Kentucky legislature refused to do anything. And they said, we have been law-abiding citizens. We pay our taxes. We appeal to you to enact some laws that will protect us and that will enable us to exercise the rights of citizens. Lexington was also the place where the incident occurred that later turned into the major Supreme Court case that established that the 15th Amendment did not protect people against attempts to suppress their votes that did not explicitly mention that suppression was based on race. So Lexington actually became one of the test case cities that wrote statutes that would pass court scrutiny to suppress African American votes. So this is where this boy grows up, right? He grows up in this epicenter of argument about what the legacy of the Civil War is going to be, about what's going to happen in terms of freedom, whether equality is going to be tied up in freedom or not, in what kind of rights are entailed in citizenship. And his mother knew that. She knew there was real vulnerability there. She would also have worried, of course, about what kind of job he was going to get, just very practically, because children like him tended to end up in apprenticeships that were very exploitative, because as the child of a single mother, those kids were often exposed to cruelties and exploitation that other kids were not. And so she would have been very worried about making sure that she got him into a good situation where he had a good job, where he was going to have a future. And she turned to her neighbors. She had an old friend who was married to a guy named Eli Jordan. And Eli Jordan was a horse trainer. He'd been a thoroughbred trainer for his whole life. Through slavery, he's one of a sort of tree of at least locally famous African-American enslaved trainers in the antebellum period. And in Lexington, there's actually a critical mass of formerly enslaved and newly free Black horsemen who are already very prominent in American racing. So if you actually look at the maps of Lexington, the residential maps, America Burns and her son Isaac lived right down the block from Edward Brown, who was a jockey then, who won a Belmont Stakes while he was living there. And he would go on as an adult to train 2 Kentucky Derby winners. They lived several blocks from Ansel Williamson and Oliver Lewis, the trainer and jockey of the first Kentucky Derby winner, Aristides, in 1875. Of the first 25 Kentucky Derbies between 1875 and 1900, about half of them are won by Black men. And most of those guys lived in some proximity to where the Hursts lived. So it made sense, I think, even for a woman who didn't herself have any horse connections, to look at the jobs of men around her who had respectable families, who were able to provide for their wives and kids, and to say, yeah, this is what I want for myself. And so she apprenticed him to Eli Jordan. There's a famous story about the first time Murphy got on a horse. This is what he'll end up looking like later, but this is, when he first got on a horse, he would have been about 11. And he was tiny enough that they put him on a yearling, who was himself just being broken in the saddle, which is of course the best first horse for any kid. And of course, he was promptly tossed and he cried. And then he got back on. And later, when people told that story after he was a superstar, you know, they told it as a joke, or they told it like it was sentimental. But I don't see how that moment could have been anything but terrifying, because he knew this was the job he needed to be able to do. And he was literally afraid it was going to kill him, right? And if you were a kid who was paying attention, you would have known that that was not out of the question anyway. In the time Isaac Murphy was between about 11 and about 17, regularly in the newspaper, you're reading about horses that are maiming grooms, jockeys that are coming off at the track, falling on their heads and being killed instantly, right? He knows this is a high risk job. He also knows it's high reward if you can do it. And so, and I think the fact that he did this at 11 years old probably tells you a lot about him. He stopped crying and he got back on, and he didn't cry again. And he discovered that he was really, really good at riding horses. And the thing was that there was this thing he could do that very, very few other people can do, even now. And that was, he could sit on a horse going between 35 and 40 miles an hour in tight company, right? With very minimal balance. And he could do that. And it was like there was an imaginary digital clock superimposed on the landscape. And he could see to a quarter of a second how fast that horse was going. And he could time it. And that was a thing that people really hadn't done before. Now, of course, it's absolutely necessary. But at the time, it was such a striking skill that people began saying, oh, well, this is this thing he can do. And everybody should figure out how to do this, right? But it was part of what made him a star, even when he was a kid. He rode his first winter at Lexington when he was 15 years old in 1976. He weighed 90 pounds. And in 1879, when he was 18, he went to Saratoga and won the Travers with an Eli Jordan trained horse. The Travers was the most prestigious 3-year-old race in America. The big upset victory. And at that point, he became really, I would say, a national celebrity. One of the reporters said, Murphy is very observant, quick to perceive the weak points of an adversary and to take advantage of them. He has a steady hand, a quick eye, a cool head, and a bold heart. The same month he won the Travers, his mother died of rectal cancer. She was 39 years old. And I have no idea how he felt about that, but I like to imagine that she at least had a few days of knowing that what she had hoped for him seemed to have come. So he started his career as the retained writer of a big operation in Kentucky. Eli Jordan trained for this guy named Hunt Reynolds, and as an Murphy rode their horses. But in the 1880s, he leaves Mr. Reynolds. Well, Mr. Reynolds died, so he left his widow. And he starts selling his services on 2-year contracts to some of these new sort of incredibly rich dilettantes in the horse racing business. So he works for people who've gotten rich in railroads, and mining, real estate speculation. He works for a lot of California millionaires. He worked for Ed Corrigan and Lucky Baldwin and J.B. Hagan, none of whose lives would bear a lot of scrutiny, by the way. When I started looking into Lucky Baldwin to write the book, what I discovered was that you had to be very clear about which woman shooting him you wanted to know about, because a number of them had gone after him for various reasons, including the lady who stood up in court and they said, "Do you have anything to say?" And she said, "Your Honor, I believed it was my Christian duty to shoot that son of a bitch." And, you know, the court was sort of like, I mean, and to be fair, I mean, the more you read about it, the more you think, you were right, honey. Like, that was too bad you didn't kill him. But once he started riding those superstars, I mean, the man did. And if you'd like to know a lot more about sort of, you know, the dramatic cases, right? We wrote Freeland and Emperor of Norfolk and Renzi and Modesty. And I mean, these are some of the great stars of the 8-gallon track. All of that is in my book, but just to sort of help you, he won 3 Kentucky Derbies, the Kentucky Oaks, 4 American Derbies, which was the Chicago race. This is the American Derby of 1893, which was at that time way bigger and more prestigious than the Kentucky Derby. He won all of these New York stakes races that are still a very big deal. He won 3 different Clarks, which is still one of the great stakes races in Churchill Downs. So not only was he winning, but he won with such style and panache that people noticed. So the newspapers called him an artist, right? And one of the things he supposedly liked to do was to cut the finish really fine, because he didn't believe in just hitting a horse and hitting a horse and hitting a horse. He believed in feeling a horse along, seeing what was there to get out of it, and then just easing him if he needed, which for a lot of very experienced horsemen was ideal. And they said, this is exactly what we want, right? Also, for those of you who are betting on handicap horses, no handicap owner or trainer has ever thanked you for bringing a horse home by a lot, because that just means he's going to carry more the next time, right? So this is a guy who's very, very sure about what he does, to the point that supposedly in one of his races, Lucky Baldwin got so fixated on watching him that he accidentally swallowed his straw of tobacco and had to go home without cashing his tickets because, you know, he was in bad shape. So what was it actually like to do Murphy's job? Well, it was incredibly difficult. First of all, because he basically didn't live at home for 8 months a year. Like, he lived in Lexington. He had a big brick house in Lexington. But between April and November, he was not there. So he rode the circuit. Like, first you went to Nashville, then you went to Louisville, then you went to Lexington, then you went to St. Louis, then you went to Chicago, and then you came back east and you went to all the New York tracks in August. And you typically used the to Monmouth Park, to Sheep's Head Bay, to Gravesend, to, 4 or 5 tracks, and you'd be riding it for like 3 months. And then you'd go back to Cincinnati, and then finally you get to go home in November. So that's hard enough, right? Then you have the really scary part about what if you fall off or get killed? He was very lucky in that he was not injured very often. He did talk about his one really significant fall, which was in St. Louis, where he came off. He managed to avoid getting trampled, and he pulled the other jockey who had also fallen and who was unconscious away from the horses, and so they were both able to survive. That's the only one he talks about when he's interviewed. Now, the press actually covers other occasions, like where he horse rears up in the post parade and he comes off and falls on his head. And it has to be picked up and taken out with what's clearly a concussion. He never mentions that when he's asked about accidents, because you can tell with him that's just like the cost of doing business, right? Oh yeah, I seem to have a really bad concussion. Well, it must be Tuesday. It is just totally and it's the way jockeys are now, right? This is just how it is. You're gonna get hurt. It's a question of how bad and when. And so you don't think about it a lot. What he did have to think about was weight. So present day jockeys weigh about 112 pounds. John Velasquez weighs 112. Frank Dettori, who's probably the most prominent European, weighs like 115. But the trick about then was that even though most races for older horses, that's about what you would have had to weigh, they were much more likely to race horses of all ages together. And so not only were the weights for younger horses lower, but if you were competing in a range of ages, then they were giving them massive weight lines. So, like for instance, at some tracks, 2-year-olds were supposed to carry 100 pounds. Well, that's hard enough for somebody like Murphy. But if 2-year-olds are competing against 3-year-olds, then they only get to carry about 90. And remember, the 90 has to include your tack. And nobody's invented like plastic, right? So it's all really heavy. So this is why most of the people who are riding younger horses are kids, right? They're 11 years old, 12 years old, they're teenagers. And so somebody like Murphy is very clearly he comes in to ride the stars, right? He rides the older horses, he rides the longer distances, but that still means ideally, for maximum bang for the buck of the owner who's paying him the equivalent of millions of dollars a year, should weigh about 105 to 110. In the off season, he regularly weighed between 140 and 150. So every year, he's really young. And he did that mainly by what we would call crash dieting. He ate mostly fruit, a little bit of meat. Occasionally, he would eat some dry toast as a treat. But at some point, you just get to where it doesn't, you can't take it all off that way. And so when he got down closer to when he really had to have the weight off, he would engage in systemic mass dehydration. And you did that by running, wearing a sweater. Some guys would actually just bury themselves in the fedora tile of the track and use it as like a sauna. And if you didn't have time to do that, one of the most popular things to do was to chug a lug salt water and rack, so that you just, immediately upchucked. And bulimia was a major job-related issue, as was foreign body pneumonia, which guys got from, being bulimic and ending up with foreign bodies pneumonia. So he's doing all of this, right? It really only makes the papers in kind of a sensationalist way, like the occasion when he once lost 13 pounds in 36 hours. I have no idea how he did that. But he was very open and very consistent about talking about how miserable it made, right? That his whole life, for months at a time, was just feeling awful. And he said, he felt sick all the time. The only time he didn't feel sick was when he went to sleep, so he'd go to bed before it's dark. And he said, here's my situation, and then you have to get on the back of a big, active thoroughbred race. It's full of life and ambition, sometimes vicious. And you're expected to control him and ride him in a manner so that his best speed will be obtained for a long distance. So he would get off the horse, and when he got off the horse, shit. Because his physical resources were just completely drained. So he always talked about quitting. He complained about how hard it was and how he didn't think he could do it anymore. But he kept doing it. And there are a few reasons for that. One of them, I think, is that the money, right? I mean, we know professional athletes, right? You say, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not at the top of my game anymore. But there's somebody who's willing to pay you a crazy amount of money for a 2-year contract. And you say, okay, I can do it. I can get through that extra 2 years because he's thinking ahead about, is this money going to have to last me for the rest of my adult life? Is it going to have to support my family? So there's that. The other thing was that his main ambition after being a jockey was to be a trainer. And to do that, he was going to need seed money. So I'm sure he's thinking about investing that. And then we also don't talk about this, but I think it is somewhat like other athletes, where when you've been that guy for that long, when you've been the best, I think it's really hard to let that go. And he just didn't want to let it go because it was magical. He's been doing it since he was 15 years old, and he didn't know how to be with that. And there's another sort of pressure there, I think, and we didn't talk about yet when we talked about it. Wait, but I think it must have been fairly positive. And that was the pressure not only of being himself and being successful, but of representing the community he came from. And I think his mother would have been very adamant about that. She was a little bit. And I think they were told that there were stereotypes about the sexuality of Black people that came out of slavery, and that it was their responsibility to refute those stereotypes. So they were not going to date, they were not going to mess around, they were going to get married. And they did. And as far as we know, they had a very happy relationship. They were happily married until he died. And she tended to travel with him all over the circuit. And people talk about how much of a fixture she was, and how beautiful she was. So he had this really solid family life, and he was surrounded by these friends who, because being a jockey was in that place and time, this sort of respectable middle class profession, or even elite profession. His friends were doctors and lawyers and pharmacists and teachers and civil rights activists. Like the Black middle class folks of Central Kentucky went to Isaac Murphy's house for parties, right? And if you look at his guest lists, it's hard to imagine that at his house, they were not talking about the work they were doing, which usually involved things like registering voters. They were protesting railroad segregation in Kentucky. His best friend is one of the ones who sues the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for trying to stop Black people from riding on integrated train cars. Now, Murphy himself never talks about that. And I don't know if that was because he was just a quiet person, that was not his style, or if, like many athletes, he was very conscious of his job being dependent on the goodwill of people who were not interested in him having a thing, right? But he never expresses those things. But I think even when he didn't express those things, the thing that really came to dictate the end of his career was that no matter what he said, people saw him as having significance. And that happens on both sides of the color line. So, if you think back, for instance, to that party picture, right? He's invited into those places. He stays in hotels where other Black people want to stay, right? He's the one who's always allowed in, which, by the way, must have been exhausting. But he's also the one who's raising all these questions for white people. So there's this one memoirist that I read who is talking about how when he was little, he's like, oh yeah, racing was the sport. We were all super into it. And he said, and every little boy I knew, all my friends, we all wanted to be Isaac Murphy when we grew up. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a historian, but he's also a sports junkie like me. And I said, I just think that's so interesting. I wonder what the next time was that white kids told their parents that they wanted to grow up and be a Black man. I said, I wonder if it's Joe Louis. Is it Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson? So that would be, 50 years later, let's say 60 years later. And he said, oh no. He said, I think it's Bo Jackson and Michael Jordan. So that's 100 years.
Wow.
And I mean, I'm not sure where I stand, I don't know what I think about that, but I do think that is a real signifier of a new kind of idea about what kind of country it is, right? That's what a colorblind society is about, right? That little kids can dream of being heroes, and they are not told, no, you can't be that, or you shouldn't want to be that, right? And that's what he represented. And I think that was also what Black people saw. And that was why he really mattered to them. And if you want to look at this, this is the track photo from, I think, spring 1891 at Chiefs FA. And I love this picture. It's actually on the cover of the book. Precisely because it is so prosaic, right? It's just the work picture. It's like, oh yeah, we forgot to get a Jack's photo. Hey, you, Freddie, okay, get in here. Yeah, okay. No, you're tall. You said, oh no, Isaac, you get the note, right? Here he is. He's got his arm slung on Tony Hamilton. Later that spring, he would be the best man in Tony Hamilton's wedding. And that's Fred Littlefield. He's got his hand on his shoulder. And, everybody's just squeezed in, right? These are all just guys at work. And so I think there were a lot of people who looked at pictures like this and they thought, this is what America's going to be. This is what we had the war for. This is what Reconstruction did, right? We had freedom, now we're going to have equality. And to them, that was a really precious vision. And Frederick Douglass and other civil rights leaders, but let's start with Frederick Douglass, had a really fixed idea that sports were going to have a really big role to play in that. And partly that had to do with his family because his son Charles was a third baseman for the Washington, D.C. Awards. So in his family, you were not allowed to denigrate sports. But Douglass actually had a photograph in the study of the Black boxer Peter Jackson, who was a friend of Murphy's. And people would sort of go, you're a very important intellectual man. Like, you're a national leader. What the heck are you doing with a picture of a boxer? And boxing and racing were those sort of, déclassé because they were associated with gambling and working class thugs. And Douglass was always like, no, you don't understand. I have that picture because that man is working very hard to solve the problem of racism. He does it every day. And I think he would have said the same of Isaac Murphy. Peter Jackson himself certainly said the same of Isaac Murphy. In fact, Peter Jackson said that he thought that Murphy had a better ability to make that point than he did because Jackson had difficulty fighting for the heavyweight title precisely because white men would not fight. It's one of the reasons he's never able to do that. And Jack Johnson, 20 years later, has the same problem for a long time. And he would say, why isn't boxing like racing? These guys, they never stop and say, well, we're not going to ride in this race. If Murphy or Hamilton is in here, forget it, we're not going in. It's unthinkable, it would never happen. And he said, so racing is actually the model that this country needs to be run. Why don't we do it this way? And so Murphy and Jackson and people like that, I think, or civil rights activists like that, came to be this test case of, first of all, when Black people are put into positions where they are allowed to perform under fair circumstances, they are as good or better as anybody else, right? That's important. But I think the other thing that was maybe a little trickier was that they were particularly important because a lot of Black people at this point are feeling this constant pressure, which Murphy certainly felt in his own life, to prove that they deserved to be treated decently, right? To prove I'm actually a respectable person. I'm not going to misuse freedom. I'm not going to misuse these rights that I'm going to have. I deserve to have them. I'm not entitled to them, I deserve them. And I think Douglas's point is, it's not like Isaac Murphy goes out there and he convinces Snapper Garrison he deserves to win, so Snapper Garrison lets him win. He goes out there and he wins because he's good. And he thought that was really an important thing for people to see. Now, Douglas himself never gets super into racing, but T. Thomas Fortune, who is originally from Marianna, Florida, actually, who had moved to New York and become the most prominent Black editor in America at that time. So this is like 5 minutes before the Chicago Defender. So Fortune's newspapers, the New York Globe and the New York Age, are really like as close as you come to a national Black paper at this point. And Fortune was really busy in the summer of 1890 because he and his friend, an attorney, T. McCants Stewart, had already decided they were going to stage a sit-in at several New York hotel bars to prove that those bars were in violation of New York equal access to public facilities laws. So Fortune would go, he would sit in because they wouldn't serve him, he'd get arrested. Then the cops and the restaurant or bar would get kind of embarrassed and they would let him go. And Fortune sued. He said, well, guess what? You have violated my civil rights. And that summer, they took those hotels to court. And Stewart gave this tremendous closing address to the jury. And he reminded them that the 14th Amendment granted African Americans every civil and political right guaranteed by the Constitution and the law of the land. And Booker T. Washington, who was present, rushed forward at the end to shake his hand and told him that he thought it was the most important thing anybody had said in the last 20 years. So these guys are busy, right? But they take time off to go to Sheepshead Bay because they want to see Isaac Murphy. Now, Murphy had already ridden lots of great horses, as I alluded to. But Salvatore was, well, nobody ever asked him about whether Salvatore was the greatest. But he might have said he was. And Salvatore was 4 in the summer of 1890 when they ran in the Suburban. And the Suburban of 1890 was thought to be one of the hottest races anybody could remember. They said some of the best horses in training went to the post. And those horses ranked with the best horses that have ever worn plates. Now, local government in Brooklyn shut down the day of the Suburban because they couldn't find a quorum because all the aldermen were in the Suburban. Now, when they won, the crowd carried Murphy to the jockey's room in a floral horseshoe on their shoulders. Now, his main opponent was a horse named Tenny, and the guy who owned Tenny said, oh, no, I want a rematch, right? I think my horse can actually win. So, June 25th, 1890, thousands of people pour into Sheepshead Bay to see these two run against each other. After the first quarter mile, Salvatore's in front, and Murphy's just taking up the pace, just little by little by little by little. And they said he did it so slowly, just a little tiny increments, that people began to look at their stopwatches because they didn't actually believe how fast those horses were. And then when they came to the wire, the jockey on Tenny threw the horse, just tried so desperately to get in there. And as you can see, Salvatore on the inside with white face wins by just a hair. This is one of the first photo finishes in American history. They shattered the record for a mile. And everyone there, said one reporter, went home thoroughly convinced that he had witnessed something that would do to tell in after years to his children and his grandchildren. One of the other reporters who went on to live to be an old man, and he saw Man of War. And afterwards, somebody said, "Is Man of War the greatest horse you've ever seen?" And he said, "No, son, because I saw Salvador." That day, Murphy gave an interview in the grandstand to T. Thomas Fortune. It was more of a social visit than an interview, but they hadn't known each other before. But Fortune was such a reporter that he kind of couldn't help himself, and he started asking questions, and finally he said, "Mr. Murphy, is it true that you really like to radically finish? Like, is it true that you really try to cut it a little fine?" And he said there was this silence. And then Murphy looked at him, just square in the eye. And he smiled a little tiny bit. And he said, "Sir, I ride to win." And Fortune loved it. He put that on the front page of his paper the next day. It was his headline, "I ride to win." And his theory was, and he lays this out, his editorial, he says, look, this is it. This is what we have to embrace in all walks of life. That you say, look, I am determined. I am self-aware. I know what I can accomplish. And I will not allow circumstances to stop me. And he says, and that is what is going to secure civil rights in this country. And men like that who represent that kind of attitude are what we need. Whether they're overtly political or not, they symbolize something about what we want the future to look like. So then they went to the party, right? A few weeks later, Murphy comes back. He's riding another superstar for J.B. Hagan. And that day, people begin to notice something was wrong. He lost control of the horse. Ultimately, he fell off and had to be picked up. And when he was picked up, people could tell that there was something wrong with it. And then immediately, the newspapers start going back and what happened? Well, here's our best guess. Our best guess is, for various reasons, including the fact that they had been talking about racing Salvatore in some sort of time test to see if he could break another record. Murphy had been trying to lose even more weight than usual, so he had not been eating. And one of the things that jockeys of that generation, and actually of later generations, shockingly, did was that they used certain kinds of alcohol as sort of like a combination of nutrition supplement and energy drink. So they actually believed that if you drank either champagne or milk punch, that you were that it wouldn't actually contain any calories, but you would get all the nutrients you needed and you would be energized, right? Now, obviously, not scientifically sound, but basically what that meant was that you were having all the symptoms of essentially being malnourished. But on top of that, if you had any alcohol with an empty stomach, you were obviously just trashed from the very beginning. And the thing was, everybody kind of knew that that was the thing that jockeys did, and that was the thing Murphy did. And sometimes they point out, like, oh yeah, you could tell he was a little bit, but nobody made a big deal of it because they all said, oh, well, this is horrible, but they all have to do this because weight is so hard to make, right? This is a medical issue, and we should really fix this. Well, all of a sudden, that's no longer what's being said. Suddenly, Isaac Murphy's a drunk. He's disgraceful. Hagan should fire him. Decent people shouldn't be on a racetrack with him. People start saying, if I had been close enough to him, I would have beaten him to death. So you start saying, well, what happened, right? This man could not be lauded enough 5 minutes ago. What happened? Well, I think you can sort of see it when you look at the coverage and you begin sort of seeing the weird places in the coverage. So like the New York Times, for instance, covers it and they say, oh, this is disgusting. He was drunk out of his mind. And they say, no, there was a lot of champagne at that party that they gave for Salvatore. Yes, that party was weeks ago, but it laid the foundation. So somehow he was supposed to have been drunk for weeks, right? And you think, huh? what are you talking about? But then the New York Herald actually gives us a little help, I think, and says, well, you know, they're thinking about suspending him, and, you know, this is what's happening. And then completely out of the blue says, you know, we think he doesn't even really care if the 1890 Lodge Federal Elections Bill is passed. And I thought, well, yeah, I mean, I read that fairly recently, and I thought, that man never said a word about the federal, nobody, that was you. Wherever that came from, that was your mind, sir. And so I think you can sort of see, you know, these guys are not necessarily conscious that they sound so, you know, like their synapses are misfiring. Because to them, it's not a synapse misfire, it's logical. But their logic is just sort of something we have to get our heads around. But I think what the New York Times meant was essentially like, when they say it lays a foundation, they don't mean he's still drunk somehow in some sort of biological miracle. What they mean is he should never have been there. Right? This was a step too far, especially in a summer where he is such a superstar. That he's now on the front page of the biggest black newspaper in Canada, right? As this sort of symbol of civil rights. Peter Jackson, by the way, was also having a very big summer, and people were concerned about that. There had also been a real sort of kerfuffle about whether Peter Jackson was going to be allowed to stay in a major hotel in Los Angeles because he was black, and black citizens had protested the hotel because it's not going to be allowed. I mean, so people are starting to notice this stuff, and they're, you know, beginning to tie in what they perhaps thought of as like this specifically athletic thing with political stuff. And that's really at its height with the federal election bill. The Lodge Federal Election Bill, which turned out to be a lot more complicated than this, but certainly the way people in the South at the time perceived it was that it was dangerous because technically it was supposed to allow for the federal government to supervise an election if a certain number of local potential voters alleged that there would be election irregularities or that votes would be suppressed. So a lot of white Southern vote counters said, oh, wait, everything that we've been doing is now going to be overseen by the federal government. And now all of these efforts we've made to suppress black votes are going to be for nothing. So, I mean, the fact that that's in their heads when they're looking at extra may explain why suddenly they're not very confident. Murphy's career never completely recovered. He went on to ride another Kentucky Derby and win it in 1891 for Dudley Allen, who trained 2 Kentucky Derby winners and is still the only black man to own a Kentucky Derby winner, and was, like Murphy, a veteran, like Murphy's father, a veteran of the U.S. colored troops. So I like to imagine that it was particularly sweet for him to do that for a man that he associated with his father. But in general, Murphy said he found the change really hard to bear. That people began speaking to him in ways that he did not think they would ever speak to him. And he specifically talked about the use of racial slurs that were things that he had not previously had to endure, and all of a sudden they show up. By the fall of 1895, he and his wife started having financial problems. And as far as we can tell, they took out some loans from a Lexington businessman that Lucy later said were like naked and predatory. They renegotiated their payment schedule on February 9th. He appeared to be sick that day when they had that meeting. Right after midnight on February 12th, Lucy called the doctor. And by the time the doctor arrived, Murphy was dead. He died of a heart attack when he was barely 35. Almost exactly 2 months later, the Supreme Court decided Plessy versus Rhodes. And in that case, they determined that racial segregation, the system of separate people, did not violate the Constitution. And the only justice to the dissent was John Marshall Harlan of Kentucky, who had been an adult and a politician in central Kentucky during Murphy's childhood, right? So these are men who have seen the same stuff. And John Marshall Harlan actually had a fairly close friend who was a black horseman. And so he had, I think, he had some exposure to some of these questions of Isaac Murphy's career and the career of other people like him, and the way these things are changing. 1895, 96 is also the first meeting where Churchill fully institutes Jim Crow segregation. And I sometimes wonder if he maybe had some of that in mind, Harlan, when he wrote this dissent. And he said, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. And he says, Americans boast of their freedom. But it is difficult to reconcile that boast with a state of law which practically puts the brand of servitude and degradation upon a large class of our fellow citizens. The thin disguise of equal accommodations for passengers in railroad coaches will not mislead anyone, nor will it atone for the wrong this day done. And I sometimes wonder if you were an Isaac Murphy fan in Central Kentucky that April, if you began to feel like all the doors were closing. But in some ways, that's why I really think Isaac Murphy's life is so valuable to study, because he's born right at the moment where things begin to change in this revolutionary fashion. And he dies right as those possibilities for change seem disastrously foreclosed. So in his life, you can actually see maybe what it would have been like if we had managed to do something better than what we did. So I'm delighted to take questions. Thank you all for coming on.
Where is he buried?
Huh, that's a question. Okay, so, no, seriously, that is a question. So he was buried in the African-American cemetery in Lexington, next to his wife and his mother. And that was in 1896. And then in late 50s, people began to get interested locally in, gosh, you know, we have this really famous jockey and we'd like to know where he's buried. But like many Southern towns, they had allowed their African-American cemetery to really get into bad shape. And so it became difficult to find where he was. So they applied to local Black people who remembered. And if you read the letters about it, it's kind of, you know, horrifying, because it's all these white people who are like, wow, we can ask Black people. And the Black people are like, yeah, we all know this. Like, this is for us community information. So they figure out basically where he is. And in 1968, Kentucky Club Tobacco paid to dig him up and re-inter him next to Man of War in Man of War Park. Now, for those of you keeping track, Man of War and Isaac Murphy have absolutely no connection to each other.
Wow.
But they're very excited about doing this because they're like, oh, this will be this beautiful civil rights thing that we're doing. Meanwhile, by the way, the Churchill Downs is trying to stop people from protesting the Derby because Louisville is in the midst of this tremendous fair housing protest led by Martin Luther King. So they're like, oh no, look, we did a special thing for Isaac Murphy, isn't it nice? And then when they moved Man of War to the Horse Park in the 1970s, they moved Isaac Murphy with him. So he is now buried off of I-75. And just in the last maybe 6 months, a year, the people at the horse park have asked the people who have now done a great job remodeling the local African-American cemetery, you know, gosh, would it be appropriate for us to return him to his community and his family, and perhaps that would be best. And the lady who runs the African-American cemetery, who's not somebody you want to get crossways with, let me tell you. When Yvonne tells me what to do, I do it. She was like, well, I honestly never thought you got the body anyway. So y'all keep what you got. He's here. And I mean, to be real honest, I see your point. I mean, when you look at what they dug up, I don't think they worked real hard. You know, I think they just wanted to do some kind of symbolic thing, you know, So, but yes, the movement of his body is actually like a really fraught political story in Central Kentucky, even down to now. They've recently had to change his epitaph because the old epitaph was about glory coming from doing your best in a subordinate position. And which they put on in 1967, like, yeah, it's great, cool. And it's only in the last 6 months that they paid to flip the stone around and re-engrave the front. So, I mean, it's, you can't be buying a new stone, that's expensive. But you can, so they put this nice quote. So it's actually now much nicer. I would feel better about it if he were not one human being in this giant. So he's like in a bush, and there's this walkway, and you walk up to this giant statue of Man of War that's in a fountain. And I mean, I'm all about giant statues of Man of War, but like, I was like, do we really need to do this? And then all around Man of War is like, War Admiral is there, some of his daughters are there, some of the great broodmares who were matched with Man of War are there. And so when they did it in the 70s, they said, oh, Man of War's gonna have his whole family around him, and Isaac Murphy is going to complete his family. And we should point out that when they did that, they tried to get the body of Will Harbut, who had been Man of War's stud groom. And they asked his family because he had surviving family. And Mrs. Harbut said, no, he is gonna stay with me and our kids. Like, this is important. And so I think basically what they did was they said, oh, well, we can't get Mr. Harbut, so we're just gonna, pull in this other guy, I mean, the whole thing is just so, you talk about, this is not, like when I'm writing the book, people keep asking me, are you gonna say where you think he is? Are you gonna say where you think? And I'm like, no, I'm not saying a word. I am not expressing an opinion about where he actually is. So it's pretty wild.
But he is honored at Churchill Downs.
Yep.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, sure. Yep, he is in the Derby Museum. And the local heritage trails have been actually, like in the last 5 years, have been like significantly really invested in getting an Isaac Murphy historic site. They now have the site of his house marked. There's a walking tour, not just about him, but about all the other Derby winning jockeys and trainers who live right in this very small area. So yeah.
No children?
No children. Which I think is interesting. I mean, they biologically, it's interesting because they were certainly together a lot. So I don't know if somebody was infertile, but they lived with her mama, and Lucy died when she was 40, so she didn't live to be very old either. And so in fact, his mother-in-law is the one who survives them all, but she dies in the 20s. So there is no surviving family direct descendant.
So following this phase, is that when you start to see more Hispanic jockeys come into central roles historically, or is that correct?
There's a gap.
There's
There's a gap starting in about like between the 1890s and like 1905. There's this very concerted, like, we are only going to be white. And then it takes until the late 50s, early 60s.
Oh, it's a pretty big.
Yeah, it's a big gap for Hispanic jockeys to arrive. And then when they do, oh yeah, I mean, just, huge. And it's only now that you're starting to get American-born jockeys once again. So that's in like the last 2 or 3 years that you're actually seeing those at the highlights. But lots of the same issues, clearly. I mean, not surviving, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, like in the 70s and the 80s, when the stories about African American jockeys started to surface, I remember the Louisville Courier-Journal publishing something and saying, well, they're acting like they're not being African American jockeys because we are racist. But we can't be racist. We have all these Latino jockeys. And it was like, okay, okay, we're gonna have to do some reviewing, And then let's discuss.
Anybody that's on Zoom that wants to ask a question, use the chat feature. I've got a comment here from one of your students who says, "Thank you, Dr. Mooney, my favorite current FSU professor."
Somebody wants it.
Is there any record of him speaking out, particularly on civil rights issues?
He
No.
was studiously silent on that topic. And
Wow.
I think, I cannot think of a jockey who was not. And I think it was,
And therefore, he wasn't a threat to white people.
until it was like, it didn't even matter what he said because being a symbol was scary.
Yeah.
He had tried to protect himself with silence and it just didn't, it turned out to be not enough. But I mean, he must have had opinions about it because if you look at his guest list, I mean, literally, it's the entire, every activist in central Kentucky was in that man's living room.
That's interesting.
They were getting out, they were registering voters, they were doing sit-ins, they were writing all kinds of protest memorials. And, I mean, I get it, you're being paid by somebody who has no interest in you having an opinion. So,
I do wonder what he would have made of another central Kentuckian, Muhammad Ali.
well, okay, so in the 60s and the 70s, his reburial coincides almost exactly with Ali's appearance before the Supreme Court for his conscientious objection case. And when they do the reburial, one of the things they say is, we so want to do this because we want to counterbalance Muhammad Ali. So he is supposed to be the nice,
Right.
he's the nice, and they literally say, we wanted to have a nice story. And I mean, there's a lot of very direct stuff, like people say, and it's not just that, it's like the housing protesters, where people, I mean, literally reporters who just say, well, Isaac Murphy would never have marched for fair housing. He would have thought that was terrible. And you think, well, he spoke to you, did he? Yeah, that's a trip on your part. I mean, he's been dead for a very long time at that point. You think, it did not matter how long that man was dead. His main role was always to be the black man who meant whatever white people wanted.
Any more questions? Well, thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you, Kat, for becoming something. Travel mug, no matter where you go.
You can carry it.
That's right, you can carry it with pride.
Well, as my students know, I'm really excited about this travel mug.
We're so pleased that you were with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Very interesting.
Thank you, everyone. Our meeting again on March the 10th will take place at Trinity United Methodist Church. Thank you, everyone.
Like when you walk right